everyone, and welcome to the Equinox New Moon forecast. So this is going to be looking at the New Moon in Libra and the waxing moon cycle that follows over the next 2 weeks. It's a really interesting time, a kind of a time of transition in many respects. You know, we've got the equinox happening. It happens on the 23rd, just before this particular new moon. We've also got a lot of planets that are going to be moving out of retrograde as we move into October. And as we'll see, there's also a lot in this particular new moon forecast about hope. There's a sense of like a reset, or you know, a kind of the possibilities or potentials that can come with reinvention, or deciding to press the reset button, or in some way reinventing oneself. So let's dive in and have a look in more detail, because as I say, I think it should bring a little bit of kind of fresh air and hopeful energy, which I think we probably need as we move into the last quarter of the year. Now, if we look at the lunar phase, as I say, we are talking about the first kind of demi-decan of Libra, and James Burgess calls this possibility. So there's a strong sense of like innovation through reinvention, and he sees this particular lunar phase as being about the kind of the midpoint between regeneration on one hand versus degeneration on the other hand. So it's very much about that kind of, you know, if you want to talk in like Freudian terms, it's about kind of, you know, eros and thanatos. So the death sort of instinct on one hand, and the sort of pull towards life on the other. And he talks about this as being about a lot to do with possibility, so about potential and how we at any point can kind of opt to reinvent ourselves. So he says, you know, our choices define us, and options to reinvent ourselves occur each day. So we can always sort of choose to sort of like pivot at some point towards something more hopeful, rather than, you know, look into the past, for example. You know, we've got a lot of planets that are retrograde at the moment, and that can make us quite nostalgic, or kind of look to the past and feel as though we've got like lost something, or you know, something is not kind of recoverable, or we don't see a way forward, type of thing. And I think this is just a reminder that there is always that kind of possibility if, you know, if we're able to kind of shift our perspective. So I think it's kind of interesting. And on the other hand, he does point to this idea of impermanence, and how there's a certain pathos in this, you know, that it is both futile and poignant to articulate impermanence with gestures of beauty, you know, because if you think about the flower, for example, you know, as I said, the image of the great morning really spoke to me with the image of the lily, and here we've got the rose and spring blossoms. And I think there's this real sense of impermanence about, you know, blossoms, that they only sort of last for the spring, and then of course the cycle of life continues, and, you know, once the flower is sort of like pollinated by say a bee, you know, it moves on and eventually becomes a fruit, and then of course the fruit then is either eaten or falls off the tree, and we have the sense of impermanence kind of embedded into mortal life and into nature, and that sort of depicting this is always to a certain degree impermanent. And I think this really kind of speaks to the Eastern way of viewing things, where there is this sense of impermanence, and that is really the only permanence, certainly within the sort of the 3D, or the sort of mortal, in terms of mortal life. But then he also talks about evolution, and, you know, it's interesting. I mean, there is this idea of like evolve, or what is that phrase, evolve or die, or and, you know, he talks about how our race is transforming out of its current imperfections towards an enlightened future. But for me, this idea of progress or linear progression in terms of evolution is problematic. I think, you know, we're starting to sort of, certainly even in biology, we're starting to realize that this idea of linear progression in terms of evolution is not actually true, and that, you know, there was this wonderful article in, I think it was the New Yorker, all about how this bird, which proved to be a bit of a sort of a genetic anomaly, is kind of forcing geneticists to rewrite, or kind of review their ideas about the sort of the idea of the genetic family tree, and how there was, you know, how one, say, gene mutation then leads to two mutations then throughout the sort of genetic tree, that this isn't actually how things happen, that it's actually a lot more localized, and that some sort of mutations make it into the sort of the family tree and others don't, and I think this again speaks to what I was talking about when I did my thoughts on the Sturgeon moon, about this idea of universality, that we've got to let go of this idea of universality, that there's one truth that fits everything. There's one way of looking at the world. There's always one explanation that fits every situation. It isn't true. And it's certainly not our kind of lived reality. And I think, for me, this is part of the pathos. This is part of the kind of miracle of life, and what makes what makes life both chaotic to an extent, but also quite magical. So yes, I mean, I would kind of argue that yes, there is always this urge towards sort of like models like ascension or evolution, but I don't necessarily think it's that linear. I think it's quite organic, and that very often, we kind of take 2 steps forward and 3 steps back type of thing, and that if we accept that slightly more flawed version of ourselves, or the slightly more kind of fractal or chaotic model of how things sort of work, then we become more forgiving. And there's a lot actually in this forecast, especially when we get to the human design, about self-love and sort of like acceptance, and I think that this can really help. But at the same time, of course, there is always possibility. And, he says our life purpose is to be the best possible version of our unique selves. And yes, that's true. But I think it's also important for us to sort of accept our flaws, and to sort of move out of that Virgo preoccupation with perfection, and try to move more towards a model of balance, that, that maybe we'll never be 100% perfect. And it's always just a question of trying to sort of balance our sort of more... our strengths with our weaknesses, that kind of thing. And he also talks about potential, and how real teachers see the potential in their students, and that they tune into another person's life and recognize that unrealized potential. And I think that's true. And I think we also just have to tread a fine line, though, between always wanting to change other people and and then that very Eastern view, which I find so helpful actually, of accepting what is. And that often when we do that, when we come from that place of acceptance of imperfection, or that the situation is not ideal, or whatever the case may be, whatever the situation or sort of relationship, that very often that then removes resistance, and then the possibility of some kind of shift or evolution becomes more likely or more possible. So it's an interesting one, but as I said, it is quite hopeful overall, and I think that's a really nice thing to have at this time of the year.